Welcome to session 7. We're not finished, but we're at least getting there. We're almost halfway through. Selection. It's a vexing problem, but in the interest of simplifying, we do it all the time. We all have our process, but basically there are small variations on the same theme. We select based on perceptions of what we need and criteria established from those perceptions. It works in selections from automobiles to houses to puppies. Actually, it really doesn't work for puppies because puppies come up and lick you, then you're hooked, and they actually select you. But it works for everything else. A big part of the selection process is the collection of all the options together, think recruiting, and systematically rejecting options until you get down to the one that you choose. I recently looked for a new computer and I considered it an important and expensive decision. Therefore, I needed to look at the marketplace and collect or recruit all of the options. Oh my, it was amazing and confusing. Laptop or desktop, all-in-one or standalone, two-in-one or traditional laptop. How much power? How much memory? How big a screen? Apple or PC? Well, the first few cuts were easy, but as I got down to the final 10 or so, it became much harder. Some had the power I wanted, but not the memory. Some had the power and the memory I wanted, but were too big. Some had everything, but were too small. Some had everything, but were too expensive. What do I sacrifice? What do I give up? What do I absolutely need? And what can I actually live without? I finally got down to 2, and I went to the retail outlet to look at them and ask questions. It also amazed and frustrated me that the people I asked the questions of often knew less than I did due to my research. It became clear they weren't going to make that decision for me. I had to make that decision. Unfortunately, I couldn't bring the computer home and try it first. Oh, wouldn't it be great if we could do that with prospective employees? Try them out first. But you can't do that with computers, and you can't do that with employees. I had to make the decision based on the data that I had. All of the narrowing down and applying criteria and assessments, largely reviews in the case of a computer, were useful and as I said, quite vexing. The positive side is that I had many to choose from because I took great pain in collecting all of my options. As I neared my decision point, I was sure I had a great chance to choose the best computer because I had collected data and amassed a lot of knowledge about my final options. I may make a mistake in my decision, but it will be a small mistake and not a big one. Whatever I choose will likely be acceptable for my problem because I took the time and effort to fully understand what I want and need and supported my decision with data, such as the selection and hiring processes for organizations as well. In this session, we are going to talk about that narrowing down process. As I said, we all have selection processes that we use, and for the most part, they are variations on the same theme. Same is true for selection and hiring processes in organizations. There is no right or wrong answer. We all have our preferences. Now, I'll give you mine as examples and ask that you understand that you will develop your preferences as well as you go along. That said, any good selection and hiring process will start with defining the job. What kind of computer do I need? Recruiting, collecting all of those options together. Applying various assessment tools to narrow the field. In the case of my computer search, that was probably reviews, narrowing the options. And finally, making a decision, or in my case, buying a computer. When you purchase a computer and it doesn't meet all of your needs, you can work around the deficiencies or you can enter into the more difficult process of returning the computer that is actually working as they advertised it. When you hire an individual, you will always have to work around some of the imperfections because no one is perfect, but returning it, although possible, is much more painful than returning a computer. I've had to return very few computers, and I've had to return some new hires as well. It is painful, humiliating, and grossly unfair to all parties. That is why I am so passionate and committed to making these decisions count. The decisions are not perfect, but they must be within the realm of livability. We have to be able to live with that decision. Before we can make a good final decision, we must be able to effectively narrow the field. So let's explore this narrowing process, and then in session 8, we'll explore making that final decision. Welcome to session 7. As I noted at the end of the previous session, we have now reviewed many different methods of amassing an impressive pool of magnificent candidates for our open position. We have studied how to amass this impressive pool of candidates using methods that focus on both internal and external resources. Let's assume that we are filling a middle management position which requires a 4-year degree in related fields plus appropriate experience. Job done. Now we turn our attention to narrowing down our interest to just a few candidates. I also pointed out that we have probably segregated the candidates into maybe 4 piles. Great, good, not so good, and why in the world did we keep this resume? And hopefully that last category is very small. But we have not likely applied many assessment tools to whittle the group down. We must decide at what point will we start utilizing all of our assessment tools, and this decision has great impact on the cost of the assessment and how much time it will take to complete the assessment process. Do we start deploying our assessment tools when we narrow it down to 30 or to 20, or do we wait until we narrow it down to 10? This decision may depend on the complexity of the assessment tools we are using and on the quality within the pool of applicants we have amassed. Keep in mind that we have used some type of screening tools to whittle the list down from 50 to 30, or 30 to 20, or 20 to 10. It's not a random draw as to who gets chosen to stay in the pool. When the list is large, our screening mechanisms are somewhat rudimentary, because that's all we need. It is probably easier to go from 30 people to 20 people than from 20 to 10. As we get lower in number, the differences between candidates becomes less and the decision to reject becomes more difficult. It also becomes more risky from a legal standpoint and from a danger of making the wrong decision and rejecting someone who would be a good fit. That is to say that in some searches, when there is a close grouping of candidates, we may want to spend a little more time and money and deploy at least some of our assessments sooner to shorten the list. Before we go further, let's define our assessment arsenal. What assessment tools are we going to use? Now, truth is, we probably long ago determined what assessment tools we would use, but for sake of illustration, let's say we need to make or at least finalize that decision now. Well, let's start with, what tools do we have to choose from? Remember, we won't just choose one, but several assessment tools to make this recruiting challenge end well. The tools are listed in your text, and I want to make sure you understand that these all qualify as assessments, even the simple rudimentary ones. I also want to make sure you have an image in your mind as to what these tools actually look like and what they do. The available assessments include, and this list, by the way, is taken from Table 3.1 on page 42 of the text in Chapter 3. And we've seen this before. Physical exams, physical activity test, a criminal background or record check, Social Security verification, reference checks, credit reports, resume screens is a big one, application forms, interviews, self-reporting measures, pre-screening questionnaires, personality questionnaires, integrity and reliability tests, biodata inventories, cultural and work environment fit questionnaires, knowledge, skills, and ability tests, problem-solving tests, situational measures, job simulations, assessment centers, and cognitive tests. Now, let's review some of these assessments aside from the text in terms of what they look like and what they do. We shouldn't have to spend much time on the first several assessments in that they are all self-explanatory and very commonplace. Also, many of these assessments are used early in the process to weed out unacceptable candidates. They are relatively inexpensive, for the most part, and don't take a lot of time to complete. Most of these are used after the resume screens, so they are used to make the second or third cut rather than the initial cut of candidates. And those assessments include the resume screens themselves, which is the first step, physical exams, physical activity tests, criminal record checks, Social Security verification, reference checks, credit reports, and application forms. Now, there are a few notes worthy of mention considering these assessments that you should know about. With a few exceptions from a legal perspective, physical exams and medical tests are not allowed until after an offer has been generated to the candidate. This is a change in the law that's probably within the last 10 years or so. Therefore, they are not an initial screening mechanism. Also, Social Security verification, reference checks, criminal background check, drug screens, and credit reports may require permission and approval from the job candidate themselves for privacy reasons. In addition, credit reports can only be used if they are pertinent to performance of the open position. In other words, you should not require a credit report for a manufacturing position or something like that, but it may be very pertinent to a bank teller position. Also, there are time limits in which you can use historical information in a criminal background check. I believe it is generally 7 years in the past. Using information beyond 7 years may pose some legal issues for the employer. Interviews are also commonplace, but I want to make just a few comments about those. First, interviews form the backbone of most selection processes. All of the other assessment tools support and lead up to the interview process. The text covers structured and unstructured interviews quite well, and you should read that material. Interviews are fairly expensive to conduct, unless the search is local, because the interview process includes paying for the applicant to travel and accommodations to show up for the interview. They also take time to facilitate and coordinate. Therefore, interviews are used in the latter stages and in the final stages of the assessment process, and often require several sessions. Now, as I've mentioned previously, the cost of interviews can be lowered by using telephone and virtual interview tools. This means that interviews can be used much sooner in the selection process to help weed out candidates earlier, and I'll give an example of that later. And it's a great tool, and we ought to use particularly virtual interviews more often. What about the rest of these measures? Well, some are obvious, but others are a little foggy when using the text description. And since this session in Chapter 7 in the text is all about choosing the assessments to be used, we should have a good general understanding of what these assessments look like. Giving a detailed explanation of each assessment would make this video about 2 or 3 hours long, which is more time than either I or you have. So I have chosen to reference websites to give you a quick but thorough understanding of the various assessments. You can choose to dig further if you don't understand, but if you do have a good understanding of a particular assessment, the websites will refresh your knowledge and also provide a few new nuggets, hopefully, of understanding. Let's start with personality questionnaires. I have used personality questionnaires extensively in my hiring processes in several different companies. I use them predominantly for managerial and some professional positions. Myers-Briggs is a particularly good assessment in that it is very common and helps one understand the candidate's tendency to behave in a certain manner in several different character traits. These websites discuss personality questionnaires and tests in general, but also provide a focus on Myers-Briggs. I emphasize it because I have a lot of experience with the instrument and also because it is so common. Integrity and reliability test. There are some written assessments that measure specifically integrity, and many others offer insights into integrity among the other factors that they evaluate. I generally have not used tests that measure integrity and related factors specifically. There are tests that do so, and I'm sure are widely used by many organizations and should be. For example, I imagine the FBI has a rather extensive process for assessing integrity. I certainly hope so. I doubt if the IRS is that diligent about integrity, but I digress. I, of course, believe that integrity is important, but have addressed it through the interview process primarily or other means. I ask direct questions to understand how a candidate has handled and would handle various ethical issues in the past. Biodata inventories. I have on occasion used specific biodata inventories, but for the most part have used other more expansive tests, as I mentioned with integrity tests. I've also covered much of the biodata through the interview techniques employed, as I've explained with integrity. Culture and work environment fit questionnaires. The information on culture and work environment fit is fairly recent and becoming quite a concern for many organizations. It is based in the reality that meeting the job qualifications does not necessarily mean that a person is a good fit for the organization. Cultural factors influence us every day in our work and should be taken into consideration when hiring. There are a number of tools that help measure someone's ability or more accurately propensity to do well in a particular culture. For example, some people thrive in a culture based on teams and employee involvement. This is true of lower level and high level positions. Other people do well in environments that are more authoritarian, in that people are told what to do and they do it. Put another way, environments that are very directive and leave little room for personal initiative are very appealing to some individuals. For those people, working in a team or participative environment is untenable. It is interesting that often people who find the team environment adverse are not aware of this aversion until they enter such an environment. They often praise such an environment as desirable. If they are not aware of this aversion, how can we make sure that we at least consider this cultural propensity? Well, interviewing helps and is a must, but there are also other measuring tools that will identify those propensities. Some are written assessments and others are simulations. Cultural fit to work in a team environment was the primary focus of the Nestle assessment I discussed in an earlier session. The short articles referenced below provide some insight into the recent importance placed on cultural fit. They also give some tips as to how to hire and how to assess cultural fit in the selection process. Cognitive tests, assessment centers, and simulations. Well, cognitive tests, these assessments are just what you might expect. I've included the following websites to help you understand them better. They measure things like intelligence or ability to reason or problem solving, math ability, etc. The second reference allows you to take a few sample tests to get an idea of your own abilities. Simulations and assessment centers. Now, I've covered job simulations and assessment centers in the previous sessions with my example of the RCA Assessment Center program and the Nestle program. These assessments tend to be very structured, complex, and expensive. They require a lot of training for those interpreting behavior and results. They also allow candidates to display their abilities and weaknesses in real time instead of just telling about them or answering abstract questions to solicit data. Don't get me wrong, the other assessment tools are good and valuable. I, however, have a personal bias towards simulations and assessment centers. When I was in the Army and learning to fly, we used flight simulators. We were able to experience the most challenging situations in a realistic environment, but still enjoy a safe return home. The instructors always said it is much better to crash a simulator than a helicopter. Of course, That was after they called you stupid and yelled at you a lot. If you really want to know how a person would behave in a situation, put them in that situation. Simulations and assessment centers allow that luxury. The following two websites will give you the opportunity to explore several different assessment tools. In addition, you can choose to take some of these assessments to get an indication of your own tendencies, traits, and preferences. You will notice that the second website is a Tony Robbins site. I don't endorse Tony Robbins or his programs. I have nothing in particular against them, but my knowledge of Tony Robbins' programs is very limited. The site allows you to take a DISC assessment for free and receive a rather extensive report back. I took it, and it was indeed interesting. Although the assessment is free, you do have to provide your name, email address, and phone number. Now, I have used the DISC assessment in multiple organizations, not only as an assessment tool, but as a tool to help teams determine the tendencies of other team members. It helps to know how other people think and their approach to life challenges when functioning as a team. I've always found the results interesting and, for the most part, accurate. Please understand that you are not required to take any assessments for this course. They will have no impact on your grade, and actually, I won't even know if you've taken the assessment or not. I provide them merely for your interest and amusement, but they may help you understand assessment tools in general and understand a little bit about yourself as well. Remember all of these assessments from the text? Think we have enough to facilitate a selection? There's certainly a lot to choose from. Keep in mind that many of these include several variations within the broad category. For example, there are different kinds of interviews discussed in the text. There are multitudes of knowledge tests and problem-solving tests and job simulations and cognitive tests and on and on and on. So what do we use for our managerial position? We obviously don't need all of them, but which assessments will delineate the traits that we think are important for success in our job? And remember, all jobs are different, and with all of the assessment tools available, we can customize our assessment tools for a particular search. However, I have for the most part utilized a battery of assessment tools for various levels of the organization and only added assessment tools on rare occasions when I had a particular concern for that search. For example, considering our fictional search for a middle-level manager, I may desire someone with particularly strong leadership skills based on the employees that manager is to lead. I may believe that the assessments in my battery provide a measure of leadership skills, but I want a more definitive measure for this particular search, so I may choose to add some assessments. I should point out that I would not add such an assessment without consulting with our consulting expert. By the way, how did I determine which assessment tools to include in that basic battery of assessments? You already know that answer. I consulted the professionals and obtained a solid professional advice as to what base assessments I would use for all positions in that particular level in the organization. And my typical battery for managerial positions include resume screens, criminal record check, Social Security verification, education verification, reference checks, application form or resume. A note, always have everyone complete an application form even though they have submitted a resume. And the reason is that application forms generally require that an applicant attest to certain statements, such as never being convicted of a felony, and those statements are not normally included in a resume. I use off-the-shelf personality tests such as Myers-Briggs and generally one or two others. I use preliminary video or telephone interviews, face-to-face structured interviews, and any other assessments I think should be added. Here's where our concern for time and expense comes in. Do we really want to bring in 12 people for face-to-face interviews? As mentioned earlier, expenses include air travel, hotel rooms, food, transportation. It also takes time to coordinate 12 interviews for a number of in-house managers participating as interviewers. One way to mitigate this expense is to, of course, narrow the finalists from the resume screen to only 2 and just make a decision. That's fine if only 2 are qualified, but if the field of candidates is tightly compacted in terms of obvious qualifications, then you run the real risk of making a mistake. Remember, quick is not better. You may see a pattern developing here. We use the hard data to narrow the field from many to a few, but that becomes increasingly difficult as the field narrows to a few finalists. We then start looking to the soft data to make our reject decision, since the hard data is relatively similar for each candidate. Following this line of reasoning, our final decision will actually be made almost entirely on our perception of the soft data. And we'll talk a little bit more about that final decision in the next session. If that's the case, if we're going to make that decision based on all of that soft data, then what is the purpose of all of these additional assessment tools at the end of the list? Personality tests, honesty measures, integrity measures, and so forth provide data on the soft skills. I guess you could say that there are soft skills and really soft skills. Using really soft skills, you're basically guessing, such as, this person really looks like a strong leader. Soft skills have at least some empirical data behind them when we use assessments, so the tendency towards strong leadership can be tested and maybe even validated. For example, our assessments indicate that this person is a good leader. Let's structure some questions we can ask in the interview to probe further for this trait. Or an example I have actually seen. Our Myers-Briggs data indicates that most of our team is very thinking or analytical people. We should look for people who are more feeling to provide diversity of thought on our team. Our data indicates that this person scores more towards the feeling side of Myers-Briggs. Let's probe that further in the interview. More and better data yields better decision, to a point. However, I caution that more data related to the soft side is not intended to make the decision for you. This data guides the decision, but a human must make it. And again, more on that later. We are not making the final decision right now. We're just narrowing the field. To put this process into some context, although a different context, it sounds a little like the selection committee for the NCAA finals, doesn't it? Now, I know many of you are college basketball fans, but probably not all of you. Although I can't imagine living in North Carolina and not being a college basketball fan. I digress again. I'm also certain that those of you who aren't college basketball fans either live with one or have friends that are ardent followers of college basketball. So you probably know something about the NCAA tournament selection process and the tournament selection committee. If not, you can ask someone. Well, it's kind of like that. No one has played in a tournament game yet. We are merely trying to get the hundreds of teams down to, if you are the NCAA, 64 teams or candidates. The NCAA committee, which for our purposes is our interview team, applies criteria, some of which are objective, such as wins and losses, and some are less objective but still measurable, such as strength of competition, and some that are very subjective, such as it really looks like this team may be on a streak. In our recruiting, the objective criteria may be a specific degree or a specific minimum number of years of experience. The less subjective criteria may be demonstrated leadership skills, and the subjective criteria may be personality traits. The NCAA screens teams on the hard criteria first. They look at wins and losses initially and say everyone with less than 18 wins automatically is disqualified from further consideration. Period. In our search, we may say anyone without a college degree in X, Y, or Z are automatically disqualified. We may say anyone with less than 10 years direct experience is disqualified. That's the hard data. The hard data may take the NCAA committee from 1,000 teams down to 300. Our criteria may take our pool from 500 to 75. Next, we start looking at softer data to make the next cut. The NCAA may look at Strength of schedule are how many good teams were included in the schedule and ended up in the win column. We may look at accomplishments listed in the resume, our direct industry experience, our related experience in the last 5 years. That semi-soft criteria may take the MCAA from 300 to 100, and it may take us from 75 down to 20. We've made great progress, but we still have a ways to go. We can't possibly bring 20 candidates in for interviews, nor can we administer expensive tests to these 20 candidates. So we start looking at softer data. Likewise, the NCAA's selection committee must get from 100 to just over 60. They may start looking at quality of wins. How many points did the team win by? Were the wins home or on the road? How are the teams ranked by various subjective polls, etc.? How do we in the NCAA committee go from where we are down to a much smaller number? More importantly, how do we get down to 1? How do we make that decision that we will live with and that will have such an impact on our organization and the lives of so many of our employees? Sounds dramatic, doesn't it? Actually, it sounds downright apocalyptic. Well, obviously the world will not end, but when we hire this middle level manager, many people's worlds will change significantly, including ours. And that's why we are included in the interview team in the first place. Now, in session 8, we will deploy the rest of our selection assessments and make the final decision. But what can you take from this session? Perhaps an understanding of how extensive the hiring process is, and that a very large part of this selection process involves paper and not people. Many people are rejected based on the quality of their resume and a few other assessment tools. Getting a face-to-face interview is a real accomplishment. You have survived many hurdles to get to this point. Walking into that interview uninformed, unpracticed, and unprepared is inexcusable. You see, your job is to be better than a lot of other people. Not only to be better than them, but to be able to convince others that you are better. Now let's go on and analyze that hiring decision.